This lecture we are going to do some theory around spatially structured populations. And so we start with the theory of island biogeography. And then we talk about fragmented landscapes, small populations, metapopulation dynamics, and that's about it, I think. So this all starts with two very famous biologists, Robert MacArthur, who died unfortunately when he was 40, and Edward O. Wilson, who's still alive and at Harvard, but now an old man. And they invented the theory of island biogeography. The reason they did was that they were aware that islands generally have communities that contain fewer species than continents. And so that's an interesting observation, and they wanted to understand why this was so. And so they started to reason in a deductive way. They said, how can we understand it? So first they said, well, given that you have species on an island, when the island is smaller, the populations of the organisms are also smaller, and so there is a higher risk that one of these populations goes extinct. Further, of course, if you have a smaller island, maybe interspecific competition is more important, and that could drive other species to extinction as well. So they say, smaller island, higher extinction rate, larger island, smaller extinction rate. And that's what I show here. And so what you see is that these things curve up, because if you, on the axis there is the number of species on an island, and when you have a very small number, there's also not so many species that can go extinct. So then when you have more species, that's why these the things are curved. Then they said, what about the arrival of new species? And then they said, well, that may be very important if you are far from the mainland or close to the mainland. Close to the mainland, there are many species that can arrive. And so they said that near islands, they should have many more species than faraway islands. And so with this in mind, they then constructed a very simple graphical model in the first place. And you can make it much more complicated, but we are not going to do it today. So what you see is the number of immigrants, and it goes down. Very simple, because you count each immigrant only once. So if a species is already there, and an individual of the same species arrives, then you don't count it. You count only new species. And therefore, with time, if you start with an empty island, the number of immigrating species goes down. And the extinction goes up. The more species you have, the more can go extinct. And then they said, very simple, well, and then finally the number of species you have of an island is the equilibrium between the number that goes extinct and the number that arrives. It must equilibrate somewhere. And then, so if you have that top graph there, then you can start to play with it, and you can say, okay, what will happen on a small island? Then the curve for extinctions goes up, and then the equilibrium must go to the left. So you would end up with fewer species. Well, that's exactly what they had observed. Smaller islands have fewer species. And you can also play around with the distance to the mainland. You can say, okay, what happens if we decrease the distance to the main island? Then there are more immigrants coming in. Then the equilibrium moves to the right, and then you have more species. So they have a very simple linear model, and by shifting these lines, you can see where the equilibrium comes out. Now, in fact, if you think about reality, it's very stupid, because this model is not considering the numbers in a species, and it's considering that all species are sort of the same, which they are not. It doesn't consider food webs, so it's a very abstract model. But the nice thing of it is it describes very well what happens, and so we use it. But so you see it as a descriptive model. And in fact, it describes things pretty well, because here you see if you, every time you make the surface area of an island 10 times as big, the number of species doubles, and it has been tested for lizards and amphibians on islands in the Caribbean, and it works quite well if you look what they actually find. So that's wonderful. And you can also use data, and in this case they have used New Guinea, and so they have an island very close to the coast, and they know how many species there are, and they say that's the expected number of species on islands. And then they look what happens when you have islands which are further and further and further away from the coast, and you see that the ratio between observed and expected goes down the further away you come from New Guinea, so that is also predicted by our model. So wonderful, yes, the model works. Now, our interest is not only islands in the sea, but the interesting thing is we can use this model to study or to predict any area of habitat which is surrounded by an area of unsuitable habitat. And so we can also use it for land. This picture you've seen before, but now we could say, well, all these leftover plots of forests are in fact islands, and we can apply the model to that, and so we can predict that fragments which are very far away from others should have fewer species, and that larger fragments should have more species than smaller fragments, etc. And it works as well. And you could even have the inverse of islands. Here you see a landscape with ponds, and you can consider each pond also as an island and apply the same theory. So it gives us a handle to study fragmentation. And that's where conservation biology, of course, is dealing very much with that problem. Now, size and distance are not the only factors affecting the diversity of fragments. There are always also edge effects, and then we have to discuss those. But their area, so whether they're small or big, and the degree of isolation, that's explained by the island biogeography theory. Let's look at the edge effects. For forests, this is really true. If you open a forest, then it's not only the surface area that changes, but it's also the microclimate that changes, and the light and the wind, everything. And that means that there are many species that can live there that could not live in a dense forest. And it means also that many species that used to live in a dense forest can no longer live in the fragment. So that's reducing biodiversity as a general rule. And also because species have dropped out of the fragments, fragments are more vulnerable to invasion by alien species. Now, is it true that the extinction rate is larger? Yes, there is empirical evidence that this is the case, and you show it here you see it here in the graph. Extinction rate goes down with surface area. And so it's not surprising that half of all the primate species in Madagascar that has lost 90% of its forests are endangered or already extinct. Now the isolation. Of course, when a species goes extinct on an island, it could not be lost forever. It's possible that new individuals of that species immigrate from a nearby island or a nearby mainland from a source population. And so then that species is rescued. But if the distance between the islands becomes very large, then the probability of such a thing becomes smaller and smaller. So that's why isolated islands tend to have even fewer species. Now you should immediately think as a conservation biologist, okay, cannot we remediate that? For instance, cannot we make connections between islands? Maybe we should make corridors to buffer the stochastic effects of small islands. So here's something you can directly apply to save the extinction of species. Small populations have another problem as well. It's called the LE effect. So given that you have a small population is already bad enough. But the LE effect says that if you have a small population, then the average fitness of the individuals in that population is much lower than the fitness of their conspecifics that live in a large population. And why would it be so? Well, for instance, if you are in a very small population, it might be very difficult to find a partner to mate with. So maybe you cannot reproduce properly. Or when you're a social animal, you might not be able to defend yourself against predators because you need a number of the other animals of the same species to defend the group against predators. Or very often you must have seen sometimes that, for instance, parrots here, at the end of the day, they go to a common roost. So you have a tree and maybe there are 100 parrots, they sleep together, and in the morning they go away again. One reason they do that is because they can make alarm calls and warn each other for predators that come. But the other reason they do that is that they tell each other where there are places where there is a lot of food. So there's social information that they share, and if there's somewhere a lot of food, then you have to not to find it for yourself, but you can follow your group members to find that food. And in very small populations, all these advantages do not work, and that's why the fitness at low populations is smaller. So we have stochasticity that drives you to extinction, and then you have a lower fitness already that drives you to extinction. And we'll see in the course of this course, we'll see more reasons why small populations go extinct. In particular tomorrow when we discuss genetics. For now, I want to stick to ecology and discuss metapopulation dynamics with you. And the thing is that maybe some of you will think, yeah, but this looks very similar to island biogeography. But it's not, because I told you that in island biogeography theory, we only discuss whether the number of species, how it changes, and if one individual of a species arrives, then we count it as an immigration. So we do not consider the population densities. So now we are going to deal with that problem, and now we are going to deal with a single species, but we're interested in the population numbers in the different fragments and in the population as a whole. So we're talking about a fragmented population. Each fragment may or may not have a subpopulation, and we want to know how this works. We want to know what the whole population is doing. We know that in a small fragment, the population may go extinct, but maybe there is recolonization, and maybe that helps to maintain the population stable. So we have a number of patches, and a certain proportion is occupied, and there are animals there. And so we have this very simple equation saying that the proportion of occupied patches is once minus the coefficient between the ratio between extinction and colonization. Now, we can already say that when extinction is larger than colonization, then of course the number of occupied patches will go down. More and more patches will become empty. Now, here you see how it works. So we have space with patches in it, and then there are patches which are occupied, and some of the patches produce dispersers, and they may colonize unoccupied patches. And occupied patches may become extinct, and so you have the dynamics between extinction and recolonization. That's what we call metapopulation dynamics. And we're talking about probabilities. Now, now we're going to construct a very simple model graphically, just as we did with the island biogeography. And we look at the equilibrium between extinction rate and colonization rate. And that tells you the percentage of patches which is occupied. Now, when the proportion of patches that is occupied increases, then of course the extinction rate increases also. The more patches you have, the more that which are occupied, the more possibilities you have for extinction. So the extinction is a straight line that goes up. The colonization is different, because when you have very low number of patches which is occupied, then there is very little source for dispersers, and so then the number of immigrants in other patches must be very low, because simply there are not many that could arrive. But then, with increasing number of patches occupied, at some point, then those patches are then already occupied, and so the number of patches which are empty are decreasing, and so the number of patches that can be colonized is decreasing. And that's why it's a curve. So you have a curve and a straight line, and where they cross each other, there is the value of extinction and the value of colonization is the same. And so that tells you the proportion of patches which are occupied at any point in time. And then, of course, you need to measure a lot of things to do this model for a specific case. Then it becomes real biology. But we cannot do that today. But we can do the same game as we did with the biogeography thing. We can start to fiddle around. For instance, we can say, imagine that the distance between the patches is larger. Well, then, of course, the immigration rate goes down. So then you get a lower curve, and then the number of occupied patches is going to the left. The equilibrium is going to a lower value. And if you're closer, the opposite happens. If the patches are close to each other, your equilibrium will be more patches that are occupied. And the same is for extinction. If you fiddle with extinction, if the extinction rate is higher, then you have fewer patches which are occupied. So you can do the same sort of predictions, and again, you can use it to test real situations in the field. Now, there is something in conservation biology which is quite stupid, and we're not going through all the calculations here. Although they are simple, you must look at it later. It's very simple algebra. The thing is that very often people protect an area where a rare species occurs. They say, okay, here you have a forest and there's still tiger in it, and so we shall protect it. And then maybe not so far away from there, there's another forest, and it may look the same, but there are no tigers. And they say, well, there are no tigers there, cut that forest. There are no tigers, doesn't matter. Is that a wise strategy? Now, what you can do is show by simple calculus that you should also protect the empty patches because they make that a larger proportion of patches will be occupied at any point in time. So if you're throwing away all the empty patches in the process, you're helping the species to go extinct. And the reason is almost trivial. You're removing habitat. But it follows also out of this model. So habitat destruction of empty patches decreases the effective colonization rate. And so you shouldn't do that. Now, and we have seen that the distance between patches in these models have an important effect. Now, conservation biologists cannot change the distance between patches of forest, for instance. So what else can we do? Well, what we can do is we can make corridors. And by making corridors, we increase the immigration rate. And then our equilibrium that will move to the right. And so we will have more patches which are occupied by the species that we want to preserve. So that's why we want to make corridors. In fact, this happens. Here you see a map of Bhutan, and they're constructing these corridors, which are the striped areas. And similar things are going on here in Nepal as well. So you've seen a few bits of ecological theory that are very useful to organize the way you can think about conservation. So I hope that you really start to learn these theories and maybe also the underlying mathematics at some later point so that you can do the calculations. And then you can really, in a quantitative way, figure out what you should do in a particular case. Because, of course, the distance between two forests may be the same, but for a small animal that walks slowly, it may be a barrier, while it may not be the case for a bird. So you always have to consider the specifics of the biology of your species to know how you should handle it. And I think I'll stop there for now.
Extinction graph. It was increasing. Extinction was increasing with the patches, proportion of patches. How is it possible?
There are two lines in there. One is the line for the colonization rate, and it's a curve. And the other line is a straight line. We do the straight line first. The straight line is extinction rate. Now, on the x-axis, you see the proportion of patches occupied. If there are very few patches that are occupied, then also they cannot go extinct. You have a very small number. So the rate is low because it's a small number. Because the rate is the number of patches that go extinct per unit of time. So when you have only 3 patches left, say, the number that can go extinct is only 3. When you have 300 patches, there are 300. So that's why that line is a straight line. It increases with the number of patches which are occupied. Each patch can go extinct. The more patches you have, the more patches will go extinct. Yeah? And the curved line is the line for the colonization rate. Now, if there are very few patches occupied, you don't have source populations enough to colonize. So when there are few patches occupied, the colonization rate is very low because there are very few dispersers. And then it goes up, but because we only count whether a patch is occupied or not, when 50% is occupied, a lot of the dispersers, they will end up in patches that are already occupied. So that's why the curve levels off. And then finally, the number of empty patches becomes limiting, and so that's why the curve goes down again.
We all agree with the fact that conservation is needed. And in general, then I come to know that we only start conserving only when some of the species come to the verge of extinction or disappear. So, can there be any mathematical modeling or maybe some statistical formulas so that we can as we know that conservation is not only related to the number of species disappearing, as you have told that it's also related with the energy, it's related with the metadynamics of population, and so on the basis of that, can we have any particular mathematical modeling or formulas, or like by evaluating the keystone species, or like evaluating the biomass of the species found out here? So can we have such formulas so that we can know the exact time when we can start the conservation process?
Yes, your question is very interesting, because the answer is yes, but the application of the models will be very difficult. So I have to explain this. We can make models, for instance, models containing information about the life history. I told this morning that big animals that grow slow and have a small number of children, that those, of course, will not easily respond to large changes, whereas some other species which have a short generation time and a high number of offspring can do that better. So you can make models that include what's named the life history of a species. Those things are called structured population models, and they're one of the specialties of my university in Amsterdam. And so that's very nice, and you can use those to describe what happens with populations if you know all the details of the life histories and the interaction between the species. And so they are very successfully applied, for instance, for the dynamics of fish in lakes, because that's our rather simple systems, maybe with 3-4 important species, and that's it. But the thing is, once you want to do that for species we do not know so well, then there is a problem. You have first to measure the parameters of the model before you can use the model. So there are general models which you can apply, say, to every possible species on Earth. But the problem is not there. You want to use the model to predict something, and then you have to know a lot about the biology of the individual species. You have to measure all the parameters in the field, and that's sometimes not easy. I mean, it's quite easy to count the number of eggs that a bird lays, but if you want to count the number of eggs a fish lays, it's already much more difficult. And so the same is, for instance, a tree, tropical tree, produces seeds, and the seeds are eaten by all sorts of animals, but also dispersed maybe by the same animals. And what you have to, for your model, what you need is you need the number of surviving seeds. Well, that's difficult to measure. So the problem is not in that we do have the models, the mathematics are in place, but to measure the parameters of the model, the problem is there.
Well, so I came across some information like there are two schools of thoughts regarding the conservation and environment. So the first school of thoughts, as you have described in your first lecture, it said that global warming and the associated climate change are the main cause of extinction in the modern era. But next school of thoughts also states that nature has a self-conservative nature. I mean, as for example, there used to be more number of volcanoes, active volcanoes in the previous times, and the pollution that was created by those volcanoes are more than the pollution that has been created by the modern automobiles or factories for more than 10 to 15 years.
Evolution goes very slowly, so we have had these areas where there was a very high CO2 and the temperature on Earth was high, and of course it has left its effects on the biodiversity. Then also a lot of species went extinct, and for us that's not something acceptable, because I mean, I have no doubt that at some point the human will, as a species, will also go extinct. and then it takes only a few 100 million years and the biodiversity will be very rich again. But we don't have time to wait a few 100 million years. We want our children and our grandchildren to live in an acceptable world. And so that's why it is true, but I cannot do much with it.
Disturbing the actual the conservative nature of conservative property of the nature by superimposing or forcefully imposing the harsh conservative measures.
I think we're talking in this course about conserving nature, but we have also concern for humans. I think we should have concern for humans in the first place. I wish that everybody on Earth had access to good food and had a good housing and had a good education, etc. And there's simply too many of us. And philosophically, it's very difficult to say we take the liberty of people to have a large number of children away from them. And so the population of humans is still growing. It's slowing down already. We are already going towards that flattening part of the curve. A couple of generations more, we will have a stable number of people on Earth. But to have nature also conserved in a good way, probably you should have a world with about 2.5, 3 million people and not more. And we have more than the double. So we will continue to take space away here to use it for the humans, and it's a dilemma. And the reason that we are more concerned with nature is that we are biologists, and if nobody cries, then the Earth will be totally overexploited, and that will also be very bad for all the people. So we are here to show people the importance of the long term. And the world is greedy, and it looks only at the